All right, welcome back to my YouTube series on Strategy is Performance. I am Colonel Celestino Perez. I'm a teacher here at the U.S. Army War College. And today we're doing episode 5, where the focus of discussion is going to be on ethics. And you may recall in episode 4, the last episode, we talked about evaluating interests as part of normative evaluation, one of those 4 things we do when we do strategy, when we perform strategy. Well, today we're going to stay along the lines of normative evaluation, but we're going to talk about ethics specifically. And I want to talk about it in terms of 4 different categories. Now, ethics is a hot topic right now as we see certain potential changes in the way war and hence foreign policy are being considered. So we see the onset of threats such as cyber, of the potential of robotics, the potential of artificial intelligence, and all of that under the umbrella of a nuclear threat that could annihilate protagonists who engage in war. So I'm going to stay away from those topics for the most part and focus on some fundamental views of ethics that I think might feed into those concerns that I just laid out. So when we talk about ethics in the U.S. military, it's usually in reference to the U.S. polity, right? So we'll talk about the U.S. Constitution as an adherence to it and the defense of it as being part of our oath of what we do as military professionals. We also talk about national interests, and this is the topic of the last discussion. We'll talk about national interests, for example, protecting the homeland or a defense of the republic as being something that drives our concern and drives our allegiance and our motivation. And these come easily to mind, but they are indeed nationalistic, right? They're focused on one group of people, our specific nation state, our country. I also, but I want to draw attention from the U.S. polity to the profession of arms more broadly. When we talk about ethics, we do talk about the Constitution, national interests, and our allegiance to it, but we also talk about just war theory or the just war framework, where the central idea is that there are 2 distinct approaches to just war theory, or 2 components of it. One of them is jus ad bellum, which addresses that body of ethics that confronts decisions to go to war and to maintain a war and to close out a war. And then we also talk about jus in bello, which is that part of ethics that addresses what is proper conduct for a soldier to do when he or she engages in combat with an enemy in the midst of a war. And so the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, as I just laid out, it carries weight for the soldier because for the most part we follow the idea that since politics trumps the military in terms of hierarchy, we draw our orders from policy, which are generated by the political community. Jus ad bellum is a responsibility of, in our case, the President of the United States. He decides when to engage in a war, how to carry it out, what the political outcomes, what the strategic outcomes will be. But jus in bello is then our responsibility. How we carry out a war is an important consideration. And then we look at the restrictions on what we can do in war in terms of discrimination and proportionality. I won't get into those topics. We'll talk about in the future. But we are concerned with ensuring we use the right kind of lethal power given the threat that we face. And we're also concerned with not hurting non-combatants, and we take care not to do that. This obviously is an ethical framework, but there's a legal component too, which is given to us for the most part by international law, where if we adhere to the law, for the most part, we will be within the ethical bounds of jus in bello as soldiers. However, there is a distinction between what is legally permissible and what is ethically permissible, and this is a gray area that we should be talking about. So we're used to talking about ethics then as military professionals from the perspective of the U.S. polity and from the perspective as military professionals from just war theory and international law. But let me complicate this source for us. One of the things I want to do is talk about the importance of non-combatants and draw that out a little bit from jus in bello and the idea of discrimination. One of the things I would like to see within the military community is a more robust debate, particularly when we are away from combat, when we are in the comfort of our classrooms and talking about national security issues at a strategic level. We should spend time arguing, in the highest sense of the term, about the protection of non-combatants. And I don't see this discussion really playing out as robustly as I would like to. But what is our obligation to the other? Well, let me juxtapose two ways of looking at the profession of arms. One of them is we are advancing national interests with an allegiance to the Constitution, and we have obligations to the other insofar as we fulfill our legal obligations. We follow the rules of war. But let me give you a different take on what the role of the soldier is. And this comes from a piece by Avishai Margalit and Michael Walzer, in which they give a certain depiction of the soldier. Now here I'm talking soldier broadly speaking to include all the services. And what they write is the following. By wearing a uniform, you take on yourself a risk that is borne only by those who have been trained to injure others and to protect themselves. You should not shift this risk onto those who haven't been trained, who lack the capacity to injure, whether they are brothers or others. The moral justification for this requirement lies in the idea that violence is evil, and that we should limit the scope of violence as much as is realistically possible. As a soldier, you are asked to take an extra risk for the sake of limiting the scope of war. Combatants are the Davids and Goliaths of their communities. You are our David. This is an interesting depiction of the profession of arms, in which it ties the U.S. profession of arms to all other fighting forces, to include those of our adversaries. And what it says is soldiers exist not merely to advance and to protect U.S. national interests, but the soldiers exist also to protect all persons from harm. In this understanding, we are the representatives of our polity who are trained and equipped to kill and to protect ourselves. The ravages of war should be as much as possible limited to combatants, and we should do as much as possible to limit the destruction, the horrors of war to people who are chosen by their polities to wage war. This to me is a very ennobling understanding of the profession that extends beyond allegiance to the Constitution, which is also important and also noble, but it extends to a sort of cosmopolitan ethic where we, together with other fighting persons, have an obligation to protect those who are non-combatants. And so this complicates this simpler understanding of just cleaving to the Constitution as our source or legality as our source. Another group of things I'd like to discuss is some items that relate directly to the military professional. I'm speaking to you, especially military professionals in the war colleges, on the faculty, and then out in the field. And I want to make 4 points related to these items here. The first is education. There are many people who are writing about our profession, war, to include civil wars, interstate wars, conflict resolution, etc. They are also writing about ethics of war. For example, the Journal of Military Ethics that Martin Cook puts out. These are important reflections on our business that we, for the most part, somewhat neglect in our study here at the War College and in senior service colleges. One thing I'd like to call upon fellow military professionals and national security professionals to do is to actually go out and actively seek these bodies of literature, bring them into the classrooms, and have robust debates about what the arguments are in those. For example, I read to you Margalit and Walzer's piece on the take on what the role of the soldier is. Let's bring that into the classroom and argue about it. So what this means is we should be reading works on Civil War, interstate war, and especially today, ethics, in order to bring it in. Now, very recently, one of the students here at the U.S. Army War College, Ty Mayfield, and his co-editor, Nate Finney, wrote a book that's entitled Redefining the Modern Military, the Intersection of Profession and Ethics. and it's going to be published by the Naval Institute Press in October 2018. But this is an example of people, both in uniform and civilians, writing about ethics in important ways, in new and fresh ways, that we should consult and integrate into the classroom experience. So I encourage you to read that once it comes out. I also want to talk about military expertise. One of the things I mentioned before is that it's too easy to go back to notions of military advice and military expertise in terms of ordnance delivery. That is, when I give my advice, whether it's as an S3 to a battalion commander, or it's as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the President of the United States or the Secretary of Defense, one view of military expertise is to say, hey, here's different ways of delivering ordnance in this situation. We can use ships, we could use submarines, we could use air, we could use troops on the ground, or some mixture. What if we were to expand our notion of military expertise to include understanding how it is that war, that lethality, that violence can break out in a socio-political situation, that violence can then maintain itself to include in manifestations of war, that it can over time change in terms of how it happens. Maybe it starts off as a conventional and changes to some sort of rebellion, and then how that violence dissipates. No one else is studying this. I think the military professional has an ethical obligation not simply to study ordnance delivery, but to study also how it is that violence arises, maintains, morphs, and dissipates over time, so that we can then advise our civilian leaders at the national security level, at the strategic level, how best to use a military instrument of power along with other instruments to achieve a desired state of affairs. And I think this is important. Another complication is integration and fragmentation. So I think that the military professionals who are taught to wage war, to destroy, to kill, have an obligation that is not unlike that of the surgeon. So if we think of a surgeon at a moment in time operates on one person, and the surgeon has that person's life and death in his or her hands through training, through education, through experience, etc. It's an immense amount of experience and training that goes into that surgeon's development. Well, if you think about the soldier, the military officer, the military professional has, in a moment in time, the ability to kill, to destroy vast amounts of people and vast amounts of things, an entire portion of a city, for instance. The training, the education, the experience that leads us to that moment should be just as rigorous, or perhaps more so, than what the surgeon undergoes. So we have an obligation to look at that preparation. But in order to do that, we need to come to grips with how it is that our deepest personal belief systems, whether they are religious, spiritual, creedal, philosophical, whatever, how it is that those deepest personal beliefs tie into what it is that the military professional is asked to do in the United States. So that's one type. And then how that ties into being an expeditionary soldier, where we are told to operate in foreign lands amidst other persons, often side by side with other armies, that belong to other cultures. This unity between our personal beliefs, what the U.S. profession of arms requires, and then what we are required to do overseas, requires a lot of thought to render that coherent so that we do that well. Now, having talked about these four things, I want to go back to Jus ad bellum. Some interesting takes on this. Jus ad bellum, the framework, is somewhat simple, where it says that the state declares war and then goes to war against another nation state or perhaps a rebellion. It's very clear. But we are also waging war in other ways. For instance, is it war, commonly understood, when we launch a drone, and from that drone we launch ordnance to kill someone in a country that we have not declared war on? Does that elevate to war commonly understood? Some scholars have looked at Jus ad bellum, and they stated that we need to study just war theory in terms of jus ad vim, which is that part of the just war framework that addresses the ethics of war short of all-out war between two nation states or a nation state and a rebellion. Jus ad vim addresses that drone example that I was talking about. But another thing I'd like to call attention to is a book by James Murphy, where he looks at jus ad bellum, for example, by scholars like Walzer and Arendt, and he gives a different take. And his emphasis in that book is on the fact that to be ethical, to be morally upright as a leader, as a military leader, as a policymaker, when we engage in war, we have to be conscious of the probabilities of success or failure. Now, this is a longstanding just war framework requirement, but he expands this to be more broad, so that what we expect of leaders is that they are to be politically savvy, that they are to be prudent, that they are to know how the world works. And for them to do that, they have to know not simply about ethical requirements, but also about how do you signal your intentions so that they are not misperceived? How do you wage economic sanctions so that they have the greatest opportunity for success? How do you leverage military power and diplomacy in a prudent way so that they work? And so what he means is to have our feet on the ground pragmatically. And this is what he writes, James Murphy: governmental failure to evaluate the probability of success properly is a failure in prudence. Certain kinds of failure or carelessness shade into negligence, and negligence can be morally culpable. Ethicists must also evaluate a leader's overall strategic competence, since the inability to or reluctance to be practical and prudent is a character failing. Once again, this is James Murphy's book, War's Ends, Human Rights, International Order, and the Ethics of Peace, published by Georgetown. I highly recommend this book to national security professionals and military professionals as they confront strategic questions. I also have a review of this book in an essay that I'll share with you at the end of this video. So once again, ethics is part of normative evaluation, where we are trying to determine what the ends are of our actions. Part of that is trying to discern our interests, which we discussed in episode 4. Today, we discussed the second part of normative evaluation, which relates to ethics. And I hope to have complicated your understanding of ethics in a useful and productive way, so that we gauge in more argumentation here at the U.S. Army War College, other senior service colleges, and within the national security community. Thank you very much.